This is chapter 47 of Pride and Prejudice, or chapter 5 of volume 3. I have been thinking it over again, Elizabeth, said her uncle as they drove from the town, and really upon serious consideration I am much more inclined than I was to judge as your eldest sister does of the matter. It appears to me so very unlikely that any young man should form such a design against a girl who is by no means unprotected or friendless, and who is actually staying in his colonel's family, that I am strongly inclined to hope the best. Could he expect that her friends would not step forward? Could he expect to be noticed again by the regiment after such an affront to Colonel Forster? His temptation is not adequate to the risk. So Mr. Gardiner says Wickham would be really foolish if he just went after Lydia when he knows that Lydia has a family, has friends, and also that he's risking a great deal of trouble for himself by disobeying his colonel in the regiment. Do you really think so? Cried Elizabeth, brightening up for a moment. Upon my word, said Mrs. Gardiner, I begin to be of your uncle's opinion. It is really too great a violation of decency, humour, honour, and interest for him to be guilty of it. I cannot think so very ill of Wickham. Can you yourself, Lizzie, so wholly give him up as to believe him capable of it? Not perhaps of neglecting his own interest, but of every other neglect I can believe him capable, if indeed it should be so, but I dare not hope it. Why should they not go on to Scotland, if that had been the case? In the first place, replied Mr. Gardiner, there is no absolute proof that they are not gone to Scotland. Oh, but their removing from the chaise into a hackney coach is such a presumption. And besides, no traces of them were to be found on the Barnet Road. Well then, supposing them to be in London, they may be there, though for the purpose of concealment, for no more exceptional purpose. It is not likely that money should be very abundant on either side, and it might strike them that they could be more economically, though less expeditiously, married in London than in Scotland. So a couple of theories are floating around now. Elizabeth, in another little nice insult, says that she thinks Wickham would neglect everything except for his own interests. So she does agree with the idea that he wouldn't just risk his place in the militia by running away with Lydia. Elizabeth mentions that they also there's no proof that they have gone to Scotland, and Mr. Gardiner says no, well maybe they're in Scotland, and we also have a theory that maybe they're in London because it would be cheaper to be married in London, although it wouldn't be as fast as getting married in Scotland at Gretna Green. But why all the secrecy? Why any fear of detection? Why must their marriage be private? Oh, no, this is not likely. His most particular friend, you see by Jane's account, was persuaded of his never intending to marry her. Wickham will never marry a woman without some money. He cannot afford it. And what claims has Lydia, what attractions has she beyond youth, health, and good humour, that could make him for her sake forego every chance of benefiting himself by marrying well? As to what restraint the apprehension of disgrace in the corpse might throw on a dishonourable elopement with her, I am not able to judge, for I know nothing of the effects that such a step might produce. But as to your other objection, I am afraid it will hardly hold good. Lydia has no brothers to step forward, and he might imagine, from my father's behaviour, from his indolence and the little attention he ever seemed to give to what was going forward in his family, that he would do as little and think as little about it as any father could do in such a matter. So Elizabeth says, my father has not really shown the greatest interest in family matters, and that he's kind of lazy, Mr. Bennet. So he, Wickham may think that he can get away with marrying Lydia. She's also not convinced that Wickham wants to marry Lydia because he's kind of throwing away his chance to marry rich, to marry well, as Elizabeth more delicately puts it. But can you think that Lydia is so lost to everything but love of him as to consent to live with him on any other terms than marriage? It does seem, and it is most shocking indeed, replied Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, that a sister's sense of decency and virtue in such a point should admit of doubt. But really, I know not what to say. Perhaps I am not doing her justice, but she is very young. She has never been taught to think on serious subjects, and for the last year, nay, for a 12-month, she has been given up to nothing but amusement and vanity. She has been allowed to dispose of her time in the most idle and frivolous manner, and to adopt any opinions that came in her way. Since the Blankshire militia were first quartered in Meryton, nothing but love, flirtation, and officers have been in her head. She has been doing everything in her power by thinking and talking on the subject to give greater, susceptibility to her feelings, which are naturally lively enough. And we all know that Wickham has every charm of person and address that can captivate a woman. So again, Elizabeth, she feels really bad that Lydia is kind of also a little bit of a guilty party in this, that she's letting this happen. She also says, though, that Lydia's really never been taught to, object to these sort of things. She spent the last, all this time recently around the militia is being, obsessed with flirting and with all of the men and with marriage, which maybe in part is Mrs. Bennet's fault in some way, because Mrs. Bennet has been very adamant that they all get married and marry well. But Lydia is really not thinking of the damage that this could do, and is kind of just letting her feelings rule all of her actions, which is a dangerous situation. And still, she is only 16 in this book, so she may not have thought through all of the consequences of this. But you see that Jane, said her aunt, does not think so ill of Wickham as to believe him capable of the attempt. Of whom does Jane ever think ill? And who is there, whatever might be their former conduct, that she would believe capable of such an attempt till it were proved against them? But Jane knows as well as I do what Wickham really is. We both know that he has been profligate in every sense of the word, that he has neither integrity nor honor, that he is as false and deceitful as he is insinuating. So Elizabeth, basically says that he's a very bad person here, and that Jane knows it also, and she's just being Jane Bennet by giving even Wickham the benefit of the doubt. And do you really know all this? Cried Mrs. Gardiner, whose curiosity as to the mode of her intelligence was all alive. I do indeed, replied Elizabeth, colouring. I told you the other day of his infamous behaviour to Mr. Darcy, and you yourself, when last at Longbourn, heard in what manner he spoke of the man who had behaved with such forbearance and liberality towards him. And there are other circumstances which I am not at liberty, which it is not worth while to relate, but his lies about the whole Pemberley family are endless. From what he said of Miss Darcy, I was thoroughly prepared to see a proud, reserved, disagreeable girl. Yet he knew to the contrary himself. He must know that she was an amiable and unpretending as we have found her. So Elizabeth, again, does not give away her source. She mentions how Wickham really treated Mr. Darcy quite poorly, and she also mentions that Wickham told her and led Elizabeth to believe that Georgiana was really obnoxious, snobby, and very stuck up and disagreeable. And we've seen from Elizabeth and Georgiana's interactions that that's not at all the case, that Georgiana Darcy is extremely shy. But does Lydia know nothing of this? Can she be ignorant of what you and Jane seem so well to understand? Oh yes, that is the worst of all. Till I was in Kent and saw so much both of Mr. Darcy and his relation Colonel Fitzwilliam, I was ignorant of the truth myself. And when I returned home, the shire was to leave Meryton in a week or fortnight's time. As that was the case, neither Jane, to whom I related the whole, nor I thought it necessary to make our knowledge public. For of what use could it apparently be to anyone that the good opinion which all the neighbourhood had of him should then be overthrown? And whenever it was settled that Lydia should go with Mrs. Forster, the necessity of opening her eyes to his character never occurred to me. That she could be in any danger from the deception never entered my head. That such a consequence as this should ensue, you may easily believe was far from my thoughts. I think Elizabeth is blaming herself a little bit there. She's saying that if she had warned Lydia, if she had told the family about Wickham's past and his horrible actions, that she may have been able to prevent some of this. When they all removed to Brighton, therefore, you had no reason, I suppose, to believe them fond of each other? Not the slightest. I can remember no symptom of affection on either side, and had anything of the kind been perceptible, you must be aware that ours is not a family on which it could be thrown away. When first he entered the court, she was ready enough to admire him, but so we all were. Every girl in or near Meryton was out of her senses about him for the first 2 months, but he never distinguished her by any particular attention, and consequently, after a moderate period of extravagant and wild admiration, her fancy for him gave way, and others of the regiment, who treated her with more distinction, again became her favourites. So Elizabeth did not see a particular bond between Lydia and Wickham. Wickham was liked by everyone, including Lydia, but once Wickham didn't really show Lydia any particular attention at home, Lydia moves on to a bunch of other men in the militia. It may easily be believed that however little of novelty could be added to their fears, hopes, and conjectures on this interesting subject by its repeated discussion, no other could detain them from it long, during the whole of the journey. From Elizabeth's thoughts it was never absent. Fixed there by the keenest of all anguish, self-reproach, she could find no interval of ease or forgetfulness. They travelled expeditiously as possible, and, sleeping one night on the road, reached Longbourn by dinner-time the next day. It was a comfort to Elizabeth to consider that Jane could not have been wearied by long expectations. The little gardeners, attracted by the sight of a chaise, were standing on the steps of the house as they entered the paddock, and when the carriage drove up to the door, the joyful surprise that lighted up their faces and displayed itself over their whole bodies in a variety of capers and frisks was the first pleasing earnest of their welcome. So they travel very quickly. They spend a night sleeping on the road. They're in a carriage, so the driver is awake, of course, as he's doing that. And they get back, and the gardener's children, who are young, are very excited that there is a carriage. Elizabeth jumped out, and after giving each of them a hasty kiss, hurried into the vestibule, where Jane, who came running downstairs from her mother's apartment, immediately met her. Elizabeth, as she affectionately embraced her, whilst tears filled the eyes of both, lost not a moment in asking whether anything had been heard of the fugitives. "Not yet," replied Jane, "but now that my dear uncle is come, I hope everything will be well." "Is my father in town?" "Yes, he went on Tuesday, as I wrote you word." "And have you heard from him often?" "We have heard only once. He wrote me a few lines on Wednesday to say that he had arrived in safety, and to give me his directions, which I particularly begged him to do. He merely added that he should not write again till he had something of importance to mention." "And my mother, how is she? How are you all?" "My mother is tolerably well, I trust, though her spirits are greatly shaken. She is upstairs, and will have great satisfaction in seeing you all. She does not yet leave her dressing room. Mary and Kitty, thank heaven, are quite well." "But you, how are you?" cried Elizabeth. "You look pale. How much you must have gone through." Her sister, however, assured her of her being perfectly well, and their conversation, which had been passing while Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were engaged with their children, was now put an end to by the approach of the whole party. Jane ran to her uncle and aunt, and welcomed and thanked them both, with alternate smiles and tears. So Mr. Bennet has arrived in London, but he's not going to update them with any information until he has something more definite to say. Mrs. Bennet's doing very poorly. Jane says her mother is tolerably well, but her spirits are greatly shaken. So physically she's okay, but mentally and emotionally she is not, and she's been spending most of her time in her room. Mary and Kitty are okay though. And Jane's been through some struggles too, but it seems like she's holding up well. When they were all in the drawing room, the questions which Elizabeth had already asked were of course repeated by the others, and they soon found that Jane had no intelligence to give. The sanguine hope of good, however, which the benevolence of her heart suggested, had not yet deserted her. She still expected that it would all end well, and that every morning would bring some letter, either from Lydia or her father, to explain their proceedings, and perhaps announce the marriage. So Jane's still optimistic. Mrs. Bennet, to whose apartment they all repaired after a few minutes' conversation together, received them exactly as might be expected, with tears and lamentations of regret, invectives against the villainous conduct of Wickham, complaints of her own sufferings and ill usage, blaming everybody but the person to whose ill-judging indulgence the errors of her daughter must be principally owing. So Mrs. Bennet is very upset. She's complaining, tells everyone how horrible Wickham is, understandably, and how Mrs. Bennet has been suffering and has been used poorly. She blames everyone else for what's happened with Lydia and Wickham except herself, or as Jane Austen writes, the person to whose ill-judging indulgence the errors of her daughter must be principally owing. You kind of have to play with the syntax there, the way the sentence is structured. So so principally owing, the main cause of this is the person whose ill-judging indulgence. So if you indulge something, you let it continue, you encourage it, but it's usually something that's very negative. So her poorly judged allowing Lydia to continue making some poor choices is really the main factor in Lydia's decision here. If I had been able, said she, to carry my point in going to Brighton with all my family, this would not have happened. But poor dear Lydia had nobody to take care of her. Why did the Foresters ever let her go out of their sight? I am sure there was some great neglect or other on their side, for she is not the kind of girl to do such a thing, if she had been well looked after. I always thought they were very unfit to have the charge of her. To have the charge of her. But I was overruled, as I always am, poor dear child. And now here's Mr. Bennet gone away, and I know he will fight Wickham wherever he meets him, and then he will be killed, and what is to become of us all? The Collinses will turn us out, but before he is cold in his grave, and if you are not kind to his brother, I do not know what we shall do. So Mrs. Bennet is very upset. She says that Lydia never would have done this if she wasn't properly watched, and if she had gone to Brighton with Lydia, this would not have happened. If the family had gone together. She has to throw in that, so then she kind of escalates the situation very quickly. So she says, then Mr. Bennet will fight Mr. Wickham. In Regency England, you did have some duels go on. So if you had a problem, you may duel someone, and you'd both shoot, and whoever was shot or most injured or most hurt would lose that argument. Not a very good conflict resolution idea, but that was what they did. So even though Mrs. Bennet is prone to exaggeration, that may actually be something that happens, that Mr. Bennet and Mr. Wickham could fight and Mr. Bennet could die. But then in true Mrs. Bennet form, she has to mention that if Mr. Bennet dies, then the Collinses will take their house and kick him out right away. They all exclaimed against such terrific ideas, and Mr. Gardiner, after general assurances of his affection for her and all her family, told her that he meant to be in London the very next day, and would assist Mr. Bennet in every endeavour for recovering Lydia. Do not give way to useless alarm, added he. Though it is right to be prepared for the worst, there is no occasion to look on it as certain. It is not quite a week since they left Brighton. In a few days more we may gain some news of them. Until we know that they are not married, and have no design of marrying, do not let us give the matter over as lost. As soon as I get to town, I shall go to my brother and make him come home with me to Gracechurch Street, and then we may consult together as to what is to be done. So Mr. Gardiner says, let's not panic until we know for sure what's happening, and he reassures Mrs. Bennet by telling her his plan of action, that he's going to go to London. Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet will regroup, and they'll come up with a plan, basically. Oh, my dear brother, replied Mrs. Bennet, that is exactly what I could most wish for. And now do, when you get to town, find them out, wherever they may be, and if they are not married already, make them marry. And as for wedding clothes, do not let them wait for that, but tell Lydia she shall have as much money as she chooses to buy them after they are married. And above all things, keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him what a dreadful state I am in, that I am frightened out of my wits, and have such tremblings, such flutterings all over me, such spasms in my side, and pains in my head, and such beatings at my heart, that I can get no rest by night nor by day. And tell my dear Lydia not to give any directions about her clothes till she has seen me, for she does not know which are the best warehouses. Oh, brother, how kind you are! I know you will contrive it all. So some of Mrs. Bennet's concerns there are very legitimate, worrying about Lydia's safety and Mr. Bennet's safety. But then she's also concerned about very trivial, unimportant things like Lydia's wedding clothes and what warehouses she'll use to make these new wedding clothes. So she's mixing in the serious and then the very silly. But Mr. Gardiner, though he assured her again of his earnest endeavours in the cause, could not avoid recommending moderation to her, as well in her hopes as her fears. And after talking with her in this manner till dinner was on table, they left her to vent all her feelings on the housekeeper, who attended in the absence of her daughters. Though her brother and sister were persuaded that there was no real occasion for such a seclusion from the family, they did not attempt to oppose it, for they knew that she had not prudence enough to hold her tongue before the servants, while they waited at table, and judged it better that one only of the household, and the one whom they could most trust, should comprehend all her fears and solicitude on the subject. So the housekeeper would be the person really in charge of all the other servants in the house. So she's listening to Mrs. Bennet, and dinner would often be served by basically servants who would be kind of act as like waiters. So they would stay with you for the duration of dinner in case you needed anything and serve different dishes, pour water, drinks, etc. So they're worried that if Mrs. Bennet comes downstairs to dinner, she would repeat this whole situation to all the servants, and they don't really need the whole staff of the household to know. They just it's fine if she talks to just the housekeeper alone, but anyone else would be a little bit too many people to let into this pretty scandalous circumstance. In the dining room, they were soon joined by Mary and Kitty, who had been too busily engaged in their separate apartments to make their appearance before. One came from her books and the other from her toilette. The faces of both, however, were tolerably calm, and no change was visible in either, except the loss of her favorite sister, or the anger which she had herself incurred in the business, had given something more of fretfulness than usual to the accents of Kitty. As for Mary, she was mistress enough of herself to whisper to Elizabeth, with a countenance of grave reflection, soon after they were seated at table. This is a most fortunate affair, and will probably be much talked of, but we must stem the tide of malice and pour into the wounded bosoms of each other the balm of sisterly consolation. Then, perceiving in Elizabeth no inclination of replying, she added, "Unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we may draw from it this useful lesson, that loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex." Elizabeth lifted up her eyes in amazement, but was too much oppressed to make any reply. Mary, however, continued to console herself with such kind of moral extractions from the evil before them. So we've seen Mary do this before with less serious affairs, where she'll take whatever's happening and make it into some sort of moral or lesson about life. So she says to Elizabeth that we have to just help each other, and we not talk about the situation and add, more anger and malice, unkindness to the situation. And Elizabeth just thinks this is sort of a weird general moral statement to say, so she ignores it. And then Mary goes on to say, it's upsetting for Lydia, but we have to remember that if you're a woman and you lose your virtue, so if you do something where people will look down upon you for having poor morals, your reputation is really ruined, which seems a bit dramatic, most likely to many modern readers, but is not totally off for Regency England. Think about how closely Mr. Darcy's guarding what happened to Georgiana, and she was very clearly manipulated, as Lydia probably was also. This is not something that other people should know about because it's really a damaging rumor and it's quite scandalous. So although Mary is a little bit silly in how she just takes this very personal family situation into a lesson about life, she does have some good points that really Lydia's reputation will probably be forever ruined, and that the world is really harsh and judgmental, especially towards women in this time period. So Mary's an interesting character because she says some fairly interesting social commentary. In the afternoon, the two elder Miss Bennets were able to be for half an hour by themselves, and Elizabeth instantly availed herself of the opportunity of making any inquiries which Jane was equally eager to satisfy. After joining in general lamentations over the dreadful sequel of the event, which Elizabeth considered as all but certain, and Miss Bennet could not assert to be wholly impossible, the former continued the subject by saying, "But tell me all and everything about it which I have not already heard. Give me further particulars. What did Colonel Forster say? Had they no apprehension of anything before the elopement took place? They must have seen them together forever." So Elizabeth wants to know the information, whatever Jane can tell her. It's noticed too the different perspectives after joining in general lamentations over the dreadful sequel of the event. So they're both thinking about what will happen after Lydia and Wickham have been found, and the aftermath of them running away together, which Elizabeth considered as all but certain. So Elizabeth is convinced that this is going to end very, very poorly. And Miss Bennet could not assert to be wholly impossible. So even as Jane is saying, this not having a happy ending is not impossible. Maybe there can be some unhappiness, which is not a very Jane. It's Jane Bennet-ish in its optimism, but even she's a little bit pessimistic about the situation. Colonel Forster did own that he had often suspected some partiality, especially on Lydia's side, but nothing to give him any alarm. "I am so grieved for him. His behavior was attentive and kind to the utmost. He was coming to us in order to assure us of his concern, before he had any idea of their not being gone to Scotland. When that apprehension first got abroad, it hastened his journey. And was Denny convinced that Wickham would not marry? Did he know of their intending to go off? Had Colonel Forster seen Denny himself? Yes, but when questioned by him, Denny denied knowing anything of their plan and would not give his real opinion about it. He did not repeat his persuasion of their not marrying, and from that I am inclined to hope that he might have been misunderstood before. So Denny's this other officer, and he's one of the people who says, I don't think that Wickham is going to actually marry Lydia. Jane says that when Colonel Forster talked to Denny, Denny didn't say that Wickham definitely wouldn't marry Lydia, so that's giving Jane some hope. Until Colonel Forster came himself, not one of you entertained a doubt, I suppose, of their being really married? How was it possible that such an idea should enter our brains? I felt a little uneasy, a little fearful of my sister's happiness with him in marriage, because I knew that his conduct had not been always quite right. My father and mother knew nothing of that. They only felt how imprudent a match it must be. Kitty then owned, with a very natural triumph on knowing more than the rest of us, that in Lydia's last letter she had prepared her for such a step. She had known, it seems, of their being in love with each other many weeks. So Kitty knew about Lydia at Wickham, and she did not tell anyone. That makes the Bennets angry at her for not sharing that information. Jane was a little concerned. She didn't ever suspect that they would not get married, but she's a little bit worried because she knows Wickham has behaved very poorly. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet just felt that it would be a bad marriage. Wickham doesn't have a fortune of his own, really, so the question of how he's going to support Lydia is still hanging in the air. So Jane ends that by saying that Kitty knew for many weeks that Lydia and Wickham were in love. But not before they went to Brighton. No, I believe not. And did Colonel Forster appear to think ill of Wickham himself? Does he know his real character? I must confess that he did not speak so well of Wickham as he formerly did. He believes him to be imprudent and extravagant, and since this sad affair has taken place, it is said that he left Meryton greatly in debt. But I hope this may be false. Oh, Jane, had we been less secret, had we told what we knew of him, this could not have happened. Perhaps it would have been better, replied her sister. But to expose the former faults of any person without knowing what their present feelings were seemed unjustifiable. We acted with the best intentions. Could Colonel Forster repeat the particulars of Lydia's note to his wife? He brought it with him for us to see. Jane then took it from her pocketbook and gave it to Elizabeth. These were the contents. So, Jane and Elizabeth go back and forth a little bit with how much information Colonel Forster knew, if they should have told other people about Wickham or not. And then Jane has the letter that Lydia wrote to Colonel Forster's wife before she went to elope with Wickham. My dear Harriet, you will laugh when you know where I am gone, and I cannot help laughing myself at your surprise tomorrow morning, as soon as I am missed. I am going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton, for there is but one man in the world I love, and he is an angel. I should never be happy without him, so think it no harm to be off. You need not send them word at Longbourn of my going, if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater when I write to them and sign my name Lydia Wickham. What a good joke it will be. I can hardly write for laughing. Pray make my excuses to Pratt for not keeping my engagement and dancing with him tonight. Tell him I hope he will excuse me when he knows all, and tell him I will dance with him at the next ball when we meet with great pleasure. I shall send for my clothes when I get to Longbourn, but I wish you would tell Sally to mend a great slit in my worked muslin gown before they are packed up. Goodbye, give my love to Colonel Forster. I hope you will drink to our good journey. Your affectionate friend, Lydia Bennet. So this letter is very frivolous. Lydia is treating this all as a good joke, which is a little bit worrying. She mentions another man who she was supposed to dance with that night, and then she's also talking about mending some of her clothes. So this is a very scattered letter, and it doesn't really seem, she doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Wickham and how much she loves Wickham. It's just sort of mentioned. Oh, thoughtless Lydia, cried Elizabeth when she had finished it. What a letter is this to be written at such a moment? But at least it shows that she was serious in the object of her journey. Whatever he might afterwards persuade her to, it was not on her side a scheme of infamy. My poor father, how he must have felt it. So Elizabeth says, well, at least Lydia did mean to really marry Wickham. I never saw anyone so shocked. He could not speak a word for full 10 minutes. My mother was taken ill immediately, and the whole house in such confusion. Oh, Jane, cried Elizabeth, was there a servant belonging to it who did not know the whole story before the end of the day? I do not know. I hope there was. But to be guarded at such a time is very difficult. My mother was in hysterics, and though I endeavored to give her every assistance in my power, I'm afraid I did not do so much as I might have done. But the horror of what might possibly happen almost took from me my faculties. So Jane says that probably most of the servants do know about the situation, and Jane wishes that she could have been more helpful to Mrs. Bennet, but she was so shocked herself and upset that Jane couldn't really step up. Your attendance upon her has been too much for you. You do not look well. Oh, that I have been with you. You have had every care and anxiety upon yourself alone. Mary and Kitty have been very kind, and would have shared in every fatigue, I am sure, but I did not think it right for either of them. Kitty is slight and delicate, and Mary studies so much that her hours of repose should not be broken in on. My Aunt Phillips came to Longbourn on Tuesday, after my father went away, and was so good as to stay till Thursday with me. She was of great use and comfort to us all, and Lady Lucas has been very kind. She walked here on Wednesday morning to condole with us, and offered her services, or any of her daughters, if they could be of use to us. So Elizabeth thinks and says to Jane that she must have been handling this all alone, and Jane kind of defers and dodges the question a little bit. She says that she didn't want to bother Mary, who's always studying, and Kitty is so delicate. She didn't want to bother her either, and then Mrs. Phillips came soon after, so there were a lot of things that Jane felt helped her, but probably she did take on a great deal of this family stress by herself. We'll just back up a little bit. So her Aunt Phillips comes. She was a great use and comfort to us all, and Lady Lucas has been very kind. She walked over here on Wednesday morning to condole with us, and offered her services, or any of her daughters, if they could be of use to us. So Lady Lucas also comes over and also knows about the situation. She had better have stayed at home, cried Elizabeth. Perhaps she meant well, but under such a misfortune as this, one cannot see too little of one's neighbors. Assistance is impossible, condolence insufferable. Let them triumph over us at a distance, and be satisfied. So Elizabeth is not happy that Lady Lucas came to see them. We know that Lady Lucas and Mrs. Bennet have kind of a competitive friendship, where Mrs. Bennet gloated about Jane possibly being engaged to Bingley early in the novel, and then Lady Lucas gloated about Charlotte being married before any of Mrs. Bennet's daughters. So they kind of have that like competitive edge. It may not really be the healthiest friendship for both of them. So that's why Elizabeth's a little bit annoyed that now more people know about this situation. She then proceeded to inquire into the measures which her father had intended to pursue while in town for the recovery of his daughter. He meant, I believe, replied Jane, to go to Epsom, the place where they last changed horses, see the postilions, and try if anything could be made out from them. His principal object must be to discover the number of the hackney coach which took them from Clapham. It had come with a fare from London, and as he thought the circumstance of a gentleman and ladies removing from one carriage into another might be remarked, he meant to make inquiries at Clapham. If he could anyhow discover at what house the coachman had before set down his fare, he determined to make inquiries there, and hoped it might not be impossible to find out the stand and number of the coach. I do not know of any other designs that he had formed, but he was in such a hurry to be gone, and his spirit so greatly discomposed, that I had difficulty in finding out even so much as this. So Mr. Bennet's plan was to go to Clapham to see if he could kind of figure out what coach mode of transportation Lydia and Wickham took and where they headed from there. Mr. Bennet was really upset when he left, so he wasn't really thinking very clearly or thinking in a very logical manner. So that also kind of shows us that although Mr. Bennet is often seen joking and in a very sarcastic light, he does really care about his daughters. So he's very concerned for Lydia. And that is the end of chapter 47.